The first thing my new CEO said to me after 26 years of building a company from nothing was, "Daniel, I think it's time you understand something. This company has moved beyond you." I remember sitting there across from her, looking at the woman sitting in the chair I used to sit in, and wondering how a place that once felt like home could suddenly feel like I was a stranger walking through the front door. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't angry. She didn't need to be. The calmness in her voice was what made it hurt. It sounded like she wasn't firing a person. She was simply removing an outdated piece of equipment, and maybe that's what bothered me the most. After 26 years of building, sacrificing, and creating something that thousands of people depended on, I was reduced to a problem that needed to be solved. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 54 years old, and I was one of the original founders of Vertex Horizon Technologies in Austin, Texas. When I started that company, there was no fancy headquarters, no investors waiting in line, no giant team of engineers. There was just me, my business partner, 2 old computers, and a tiny rented office where the air conditioner broke every summer. I still remember sitting there at 2 a.m., drinking terrible coffee and writing the first lines of code that would eventually become the foundation of our entire platform. Back then, nobody thought we would become anything special. Some people even laughed when I told them we were building technology that could compete with companies 10 times our size. But I believed in it. I believed that if you surrounded yourself with smart people, worked harder than everyone else, and refused to quit when things got difficult, you could build something meaningful, and somehow, against all odds, we did. Over the next 2 decades, Vertex Horizon grew from a small startup into a technology company with hundreds of employees and clients around the world. I watched people who started as interns become department leaders. I watched young engineers who were afraid to speak during meetings become the people everyone looked to for answers. Those were the moments I was most proud of. Not the awards, not the newspaper articles, not the fancy dinners with executives. It was seeing people grow. My wife, Emily, used to tell me I cared more about my employees than I cared about myself. She would joke, "Daniel, if the building caught fire, you'd probably run back inside to save the servers before you remembered your own wallet." And honestly, she wasn't completely wrong. I laughed every time she said it because she knew me better than anyone. I wasn't perfect. I missed anniversaries. I worked through holidays. I spent too many nights staring at computer screens while my family slept. There were moments when I wondered if I was giving too much of myself to the company. But every time I walked through those doors and saw what we had built, I felt it was worth it. I thought one day I would slowly step away. Maybe mentor younger leaders. Maybe help guide the next generation. I never imagined I would be pushed out like I was never part of the story. The changes began when the board hired Victoria Kane as the new CEO. At first, I actually respected her. She was intelligent, confident, and had a reputation for turning struggling companies around. She walked into meetings prepared, asked difficult questions, and challenged people. I liked that. A company can't survive by staying comfortable forever. Growth requires change. I understood that better than anyone. But over time, I noticed something different. Victoria didn't just want to improve the company. She wanted to separate herself from everything that came before her. She started referring to our original systems as legacy problems. She called longtime employees people attached to outdated methods. She began replacing experienced managers with younger executives who agreed with everything she said. During one leadership meeting, someone mentioned how our original technology helped build the company's reputation. Victoria smiled and said, "We should stop celebrating old victories. The market doesn't care what you did 10 years ago." Everyone went quiet. I remember looking around the table and seeing people avoid eye contact, because everyone understood what she was really saying. The past was becoming inconvenient, and I was part of that past. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. I scheduled a private meeting with her because I didn't want conflict. I wanted understanding. I walked into her office carrying a folder of ideas about the future of the company. Instead, I noticed something strange. The photos from the first product launch were gone. The small awards from our early years were gone. Even the old wooden desk where I had spent thousands of hours working had been replaced with a modern glass table. Maybe it sounds silly, but that moment stayed with me. It wasn't about furniture. It was about what the change represented. The history had been erased. Victoria looked at me and said, "Daniel, I appreciate what you've done, but this company is entering a different era." I asked her, "What exactly does that mean?" She folded her hands and replied, "It means we need leaders who understand where technology is going. not leaders who are attached to where it came from. I sat there quietly for a moment because I honestly didn't know whether to laugh or be offended. The technology she was talking about, the systems she wanted to improve, the products that made the company valuable, I had personally created many of them. But I didn't argue. I had spent my entire career solving problems, and I knew some battles weren't won by raising your voice. I believed time would reveal the truth. I was wrong. A few weeks later, Victoria called me into the boardroom. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was different. There were 3 executives sitting at the table. A representative from Human Resources was there, and near the entrance stood a security employee pretending not to be part of the conversation. That was when I realized this wasn't a meeting. It was a performance. A decision had already been made. Victoria looked up and gave me a polite smile. "Daniel, please sit down." I sat across from her, the same woman who had once asked me for advice about the company, and now she couldn't even look at me like a colleague. She placed a folder in front of me. "After careful consideration, the board has decided to move forward without your involvement." I opened the folder slowly. Inside was my termination agreement, my position, my compensation, my benefits. Everything that represented 26 years of commitment was reduced to paperwork. I looked at her and asked, "Why?" She leaned back in her chair and answered without hesitation, "Because you're obsolete, Daniel. This is a new company now." For a second, I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't have a response, but because I was trying to understand how someone could erase decades of work with one word. Obsolete. I thought about Emily. I thought about the medical treatment she depended on. I thought about the employees who had trusted me. I thought about all the nights when I stayed late because I believed the company was bigger than any one person. And then I realized something. Victoria thought she was removing an employee. She thought she was cutting away the past so she could build the future. But she didn't know one very important detail. The future she wanted to control was still connected to the person she had just thrown away. I signed the papers. I stood up. Nobody stopped me. Nobody thanked me. Nobody even shook my hand. I picked up the small cardboard box they gave me and walked toward the door. Security followed beside me through the hallway where I had walked every morning for more than 2 decades. Employees watched from their desks. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked shocked. Some looked away because they didn't know what to say. I didn't blame them. Most people don't know how to react when they watch someone lose everything in a place they helped create. I reached the elevator, looked back one last time, and held that box a little tighter. Inside were old photos, a coffee mug, a few handwritten notes, and memories of a company that no longer seemed to remember me. But underneath those memories was another folder, the one thing I made sure to carry myself. A folder that contained information Victoria never knew existed. Information that would soon force everyone at Vertex Horizon to remember exactly who built the foundation they were standing on. I drove home that evening with the same cardboard box sitting on the passenger seat where I used to keep my laptop bag. It was strange how something so small could feel so heavy. That box wasn't filled with expensive things. There was an old company mug with a crack near the handle, a picture of the original team standing outside our first office, a few handwritten notes from engineers who had worked with me for years, and a small plaque from the day we reached our first major milestone. Things most people would probably throw away. But to me, they represented a lifetime. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't even turn off the engine right away. I just sat there staring at the house, trying to figure out how a normal Tuesday morning had turned into the day I was removed from the company I helped create. Emily came outside after a few minutes. She didn't ask if something happened. She already knew. She looked at my face, then looked at the box, and quietly said, "They actually did it." I nodded. I wanted to say I was fine, but after 28 years together, she could read me better than anyone. She knew I wasn't upset about losing a title. She knew I wasn't even angry about losing money. What hurt was realizing that people who once called me a partner now treated me like a problem they needed to eliminate. That night, after dinner, I couldn't sleep. I walked into my home office, opened the box, and started looking through everything. I found old photos, early sketches, and documents from the first years of Vertex Horizon. Every piece reminded me of a different chapter. The nights when we weren't sure payroll would clear, the first customer who trusted us, the young engineers who stayed late because they believed in the mission. And then I opened the folder I had carried out separately, the one Victoria never saw, the one thing I knew I needed to protect. Inside were documents connected to the original technology behind Vertex Horizon's biggest products, Most people inside the company thought they understood how the company was built. They thought it was about funding, marketing, sales teams, and executives making decisions in expensive conference rooms. But they forgot something very simple. Before there was a company, there was an invention. And before there was an invention, there was a person sitting alone at a desk trying to solve a problem nobody else believed was possible. When Vertex Horizon went through restructuring several years earlier, everyone was focused on expansion. We were preparing for international growth, new investors, and a major shift in leadership. Lawyers were moving through thousands of pages of documents. Executives were discussing valuations. Everyone was looking toward the future. During that process, several agreements were updated, but one thing was never properly completed: the ownership transfer of my original intellectual property. The 39 core patents I had developed before the restructuring remained registered under my private company, Harper Innovations LLC. They weren't owned by Vertex Horizon. They were licensed for use. There was a difference, a very important difference. At the time, I never thought of it as a weapon. I wasn't planning some future battle. I simply followed the advice of my attorney, who told me that my inventions needed proper documentation before any permanent transfer happened. The company could use the technology, but the final paperwork was never completed. Everyone assumed someone else had handled it, and in business, assumptions are sometimes the most expensive mistakes people make. Those patents weren't just legal documents. They represented years of my life. The cloud optimization framework that helped our systems run faster, the security architecture that protected customer information, the machine learning process that allowed our platform to adapt more efficiently. These were the foundations of everything Victoria was now calling the future. The funny thing was, the person she considered outdated was the person who built the tools she wanted to use to replace the old ways. Around midnight, I called my intellectual property attorney, Marcus Bell. He answered after one ring. He knew from my voice that something was wrong. "Daniel, what's going on?" he asked. I told him everything: the meeting, the termination letter, the security escort, the sentence that kept replaying in my head: "You're obsolete." There was silence on the phone for a few seconds. Then Marcus said, "Daniel, I need you to send me every document you have, because if I'm reading this correctly, they may have just made the biggest mistake in the company's history." We spent the next several hours reviewing contracts, patent records, and old agreements. There was no anger in that conversation, no emotional reaction, just facts. And the facts were clear. Vertex Horizon had built its entire business around technology they did not fully own. By sunrise, we had a plan. The first step was a formal legal notice informing the company that continued use of the patented technology required a proper licensing agreement. The second step was confirming ownership records through official channels. The third step was notifying the board and investors so nobody could claim they were unaware of the situation. I knew exactly what would happen once that letter arrived. Some people would call me bitter. Some would say I was trying to punish the company. But that wasn't the truth. I didn't want to destroy Vertex Horizon. Too many good people worked there. Too many families depended on those jobs. I wanted accountability. I wanted them to understand that you cannot remove someone from the foundation and expect the building to stay exactly the same. The letter arrived at Vertex Horizon the next morning. At first, nobody took it seriously. I heard later that Victoria barely looked at the first page before saying, "This is just Daniel trying to make noise." That sentence would come back to haunt her, because within an hour, their legal department started reviewing the documents. Then the tone changed. Their lawyers stopped calling it noise. They started calling emergency meetings. They pulled the original restructuring files. They searched for transfer agreements. They looked through every contract connected to the technology. And slowly, the truth became impossible to ignore. The patents were still mine. The systems were built on my inventions. The company that had just removed me was now depending on me more than ever. By that afternoon, Victoria called my phone. A week earlier, she couldn't even offer me a handshake. Now she sounded different. "Daniel, we need to talk about this situation." I almost laughed because the difference was incredible. A few days earlier, I was someone who didn't belong. Now I was someone they urgently needed. I said, "Victoria, that's interesting. Because the last time we talked, you told me the company had moved beyond me." She paused. Then she started explaining that the situation was complicated, that decisions were made based on incomplete information, that nobody intended for this outcome. But I remembered that boardroom. I remembered the security guard standing by the door. I remembered carrying my box through the hallway while people watched silently. So, I asked her one simple question. If I was really obsolete, why is everything you built still running on what I created? For the first time since I met her, Victoria had no answer. The next several days changed everything. Investors wanted explanations. Board members demanded answers. Employees who had stayed quiet began reaching out. Some apologized. Some admitted they knew the way I was removed felt wrong, but they were afraid to challenge leadership. The company that had once been moving forward with confidence was suddenly dealing with a crisis nobody saw coming. And the biggest problem was not the technology. It was the realization that they had underestimated the one person they should have understood the most. Me. 2 weeks after the day I walked out of Vertex Horizon carrying a cardboard box, I walked back into the same boardroom where Victoria Kane had looked me in the eyes and told me I was obsolete. The strange thing was, the room looked exactly the same. Same table, same chairs, same glass walls overlooking the city, but the feeling was completely different. The last time I sat there, I was an employee waiting to hear why my career was ending. This time, I walked in knowing something they had finally learned. The company could replace a position, but it couldn't replace the person who created the foundation. The atmosphere was quiet when I entered. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. Nobody was talking about the next big strategy or celebrating the future. They were dealing with the consequences of a decision they never expected to regret. The board had already started an internal review. Investors were asking questions. Executives who once supported Victoria's decision were suddenly trying to explain why nobody had properly checked the ownership of the company's most important technology. The woman sitting across from me was not Victoria. She had been placed on administrative leave while the board investigated what happened. Instead, there was a new interim CEO named Andrew Collins, a man who had spent most of his career in technology leadership. He looked tired, but he was honest. And honestly, that was the first thing I respected from Vertex Horizon in weeks. He looked at me and said, "Daniel, we made a serious mistake." I sat there quietly for a moment because those were words I never expected to hear from anyone in that company. For years, I had been trying to convince people that experience mattered, that history mattered, that the people who built something deserved to be heard before they were replaced. Now, they were finally listening. They presented the settlement proposal. Full restoration of Emily's healthcare benefits, compensation for the loss of my position, a long-term licensing agreement for the patents, a consulting role if I wanted to return. A few years earlier, I probably would have signed immediately. I spent most of my life wanting nothing more than to see Vertex Horizon succeed. But sitting there, I realized something important. I didn't need to go back to prove I belonged. I didn't need the title of founder or the corner office or the respect of people who had already shown me how quickly they could take it away. What I needed was for them to understand why what happened was wrong. I looked across the table and said, I don't want to see this company destroyed. There are good people here, employees who had nothing to do with this decision, families who depend on these jobs. But I need you to understand something. The biggest mistake wasn't losing access to my patents. The biggest mistake was believing the person who created the foundation had no value anymore. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. And honestly, that silence said more than any apology could have. The final agreement was signed days later. 10 years of exclusive licensing rights, full protection for the technology, restored benefits for my family, and a formal acknowledgement of my role in building the company. But the thing I remember most wasn't the contract. It was the moment when the new CEO picked up the same pen I had used years earlier to sign the first company documents. A small detail, maybe, but after everything that happened, it meant something. Because the story was never really about patents, money, or winning a battle against someone who underestimated me. It was about something much simpler. Respect. Looking back now, I don't hate Victoria. I don't even think she was a terrible person. I think she made the mistake a lot of people make when they get power. She started believing that moving forward meant forgetting who helped them get there. She saw age and experience as obstacles instead of advantages. She thought the future belonged only to people who looked like the future. But she forgot one thing. Every future is built on someone's past work. Today, I spend my time helping young engineers and entrepreneurs build their own ideas, and I tell them the same thing I wish more leaders understood. Never underestimate the people who built the road you're walking on. Technology changes, companies change, leadership changes, but the value of someone who knows how to create, solve problems, And build something from nothing doesn't disappear just because someone decides they are no longer convenient. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone with years of experience pushed aside because people assumed they were outdated? Do you think companies today move too quickly to replace the people who built them? Or do you believe every generation has to make room for the next one? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know where you stand, because sometimes the biggest lessons in business and life come from the people everyone else was ready to ignore.